Hey, Grill fam, it's Gerren Keith Gaynor, White House correspondent and managing editor of politics at theGrio, and I'm here with 2024 presidential candidate Marianne Williamson. Ms. Williamson, welcome to theGrio. Pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So 4 years ago, you launched your campaign for president seeking the Democratic nomination in 2020. Ultimately, you dropped out of the race before the primary elections. What made you decide to put your name back in the race for the 2024 presidential election? What's different this time?
Well, obviously, the country's in a very different place. I think all of us are. I think running for president is something that is a deep gut call. You don't do it unless every part of you says, this is what I am supposed to do with my life. It's not an easy thing to do. It's somewhat brutal. It's exhilarating and it's brutal. I believe that many of the things that I talked about 4 years ago, the problems that I addressed, are even more true today. I think that people are more open today to a conversation that I'm having, including at this time, the possibility of an actual economic U-turn in this country. We live in a society which is economically unjust for the majority of people. We have had over the last 48 years a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the 1% of people. So what the president's agenda says is, look, life's tough and I'll help you survive it. I'll help ameliorate the stress of living in a situation where 60% of people, for instance, are living paycheck to paycheck. My agenda is something that I think people realize is reasonable. Why don't we just end the injustice? Why don't the American people get what the average citizen of every other advanced democracy gets? They get universal health care. They get tuition-free college and university, which we had until the 1960s. They get free childcare. They get a guaranteed livable wage. They get family and sick pay. So Americans are waking up, and I think that there's a listening to what I'm saying. That first of all, I think there's a listening to me, but more importantly, it needs to be said. And that is an agenda that needs to be effectuated. I'm a Democrat. I think that it's the only agenda that's going to beat back the Republicans in 2024. But more importantly, I think it's the agenda that's going to repair this country.
Obviously, no sitting president wants to be primaried. And I can imagine that the administration and Democratic leadership are not necessarily happy about your campaign for president. There are also critics who have called you a fringe candidate who has a long shot path to the Oval Office. What is your response to critics? Okay,
so I grew up at a time when Eugene McCarthy primaried LBJ, Bobby Kennedy primaried LBJ. Nobody even thought about saying you can't or you shouldn't. It's called a democracy. And people, Democratic voters and the American people, should hear as many voices with as many ideas, particularly at a time like this. People should hear as many options as are out there. This should not be a decision made by a bunch of men sitting around a table smoking cigars, deciding who the nominee should be like 100 years ago. No sitting president wants it. Well, hey, there are a lot of things they don't want. This isn't a democracy where people run. As far as me being a long shot is concerned, I think that's exactly what we said about Donald Trump. And for that matter, Barack Obama was considered a long shot when he first ran. Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in, remember? So they say things like this because they'll say whatever it takes to peripheralize a candidacy which is inconvenient to them.
I remember in your last campaign for president, you talking about the ways in which hate has been harnessed in America's politics, and how there is opportunity for love to be harnessed in a different way in American politics. Do you find that when talking about things like love, and given your background as a author about spirituality, that it's almost a dirty word in politics?
Well, there is not just a Democratic, a political elite to whom the conversation sounds airy-fairy or silly, unless it's someone like a Cory Booker who mentions it, or, some male minister mentions it. Then they say, oh, yes, sir, that sounds great. So that's just an inconvenience for them that I bring up something more expansive than their political dialogue, which actually is sort of based in 1984. I can tell you this, when I'm talking to voters, they don't think it's ridiculous. The voters in this country realize, and the very people that you mentioned actually realize as well, we have a problem on our hands. Hatred in all its most virulent forms, white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism, these ancient malevolent forces of mind have been harnessed in our time as they've been harnessed before for political purposes, and they are shouting. And at a time when hate is shouting, love cannot afford to whisper. We need to harness what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. We need to harness love of justice, love of democracy, love of one another, love of the earth. So absolutely, we need to harness the counterforce to all that hatred that's out there. We need to harness it for political purposes. And the people that I talk to who are actual voters don't think that that's a joke whatsoever.
President Biden, Vice President Harris, and their administration has been touted by many in the Democratic Party for passing some of the most landmark legislation since FDR and Lyndon B. Johnson, from the bipartisan infrastructure law to the Inflation Reduction Act, and even some of the federal investments from the American Rescue Plan. How would you assess the job performance of the Biden-Harris administration, and why do you believe that you can do a better job?
Well, the president defeated Trump, and for that, we owe him a debt of gratitude. The president has taken incremental approaches, as I mentioned before, which have ameliorated some of the stress that people are living with. But people still do not have universal health care. He has said that he would veto a Medicare for all bill. He promised that we would be raising the minimum wage, and when it went beyond federal workers, once it hit the no from the parliamentarian who actually has no political authority, they just left it at that. They halved the child poverty rate in this country with the child tax credit. But then when that expired, they did not bother to permanentize it. The president said that he has recognized that the existential threat posed by climate change, but he's actually given more drilling permits even than Trump did. And now he has okayed the Willow Project, which is an $8 billion project of fossil fuel extraction in the North Slope of Alaska that will have catastrophic environmental consequences. The president, once again, what he has done, some of which is to be commended, is not this radical FDR type stuff that the PR, that they come up with in PR tanks, think tanks in Washington. The president is taking an incremental approach. He himself had said nothing would fundamentally change. So when the president and those who say the lines that you said before say that we should be so happy because the economy is doing well, it's doing well for 20% of Americans, and that is not enough to win the race. So 20% of Americans are doing fine in the United States, but living on a kind of economic enchanted island that is surrounded by a sea of economic despair. Now, to go into the 2024 race with a message that the economy is doing well, when it's only doing well for 20% of the people, to even say that things are doing well is so contrary to the visceral experience of the majority of Americans. And it won't work in 2024. In 2024, we need to say to the American people, and I am the one who would say that, you deserve an economic U-turn. You deserve what the citizens in every other advanced democracy have. You deserve universal health care. You deserve tuition-free college. You deserve those college loans simply eradicated. You deserve free child care. You deserve family leave, sick pay, and a guaranteed living wage. That is where money comes from. Help people thrive. Don't just help people survive, which is what the president's agenda does. And I think he does it with good intention. We need to help people thrive. I think we need to be very clear what we're facing here. We are facing a neo-fascist authoritarian threat. But FDR said that we would not have to worry about a fascist threat as long as democracy delivered on its promises. Democracy is not delivering on its promises. For the richest country in the world not to have universal health care, for the richest country in the world not to have paid family leave, for the richest country in the world not to have tuition-free colleges, and for one reason only, because we have a corporate aristocracy where the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies, the big food companies, the big chemical companies, the big agricultural companies, the gun manufacturers, big oil and defense contractors voters own this country. And when you ask me what was different between now and 4 years ago, I think it's how many people have awakened on the left and on the right to the fact that we have basically a form of corporate tyranny in this country. The government should be protecting the people, not enabling these big corporate monopolies the way they are. The president pushes back a little. I would push back a lot.
And how would you respond to, how would you react or govern rather to a divided Congress? Obviously, the president can only do but so much. You talk about many of these issues relating to the economy and to healthcare, but you alone would not be able to do that. Can you talk to the challenges that you would ultimately have to navigate with what we see in the current Congress today?
Well, obviously, the president doesn't have a magic wand. We don't have dictators here. We don't want our president to have a magic wand. The president has to work with a co-equal branch of government. Obviously, for any president, including this one, it's a lot easier when you have the House. It's a lot easier when you have the Senate. Right now, he doesn't have the House. He does have the Senate. So for every president, obviously, if you do have one party that's against you, particularly if it's a party the way the Republicans are now, where they're very obstructionist to anything the president would want, then it's harder. But the president still has a lot of power. The president still has executive orders. The president still has a capacity to appoint heads of agencies. And most importantly, I think the president has a bully pulpit. And I would use that bully pulpit. And I think I would use it to great effect.
In your 2020 presidential campaign, a core part of your campaign was the issue of reparations. Obviously, a topic that is incredibly important to African Americans and the descendants of the enslaved in the U.S. As it relates to reparations today, the issue of reparations in Washington, the Biden administration, even as recently as this week, has said that the president supports H.R. 40, which would create a commission to study the issue of reparations, but believes that should be done, that should come from Congress. What is your commitment in terms of the issue of reparations, and do you believe that this administration is handling the issue effectively?
Well, first of all, H.R. 40 came from an old friend of mine, the now deceased John Conyers, Representative John Conyers from Detroit. John Conyers would be the first one to raise his eyes. That was then, and this is now. To be honest, we don't need another study. We know the facts are in. We don't need a more, this is a way to just kick something down the road at this point. We really don't need another study about the effects of slavery on the last 150 years of our society. It's time to actually begin to do something about it. And of course, they say, oh, Congress should handle it. Of course, there should be another study. This is classic deflection of a presidential administration which doesn't want to have to deal with it at all. It's not only that, but there has been no serious police reform. There has been no serious police reform under this administration. And there has been, even though when you look at how Black people voting for this president and also voting for Democrats in 2022 have been so responsible for the Democratic wins and the Democratic power that exists now in this Congress. The fact that there has been no serious police reform, the fact that there has been no serious codification of voting rights, I'm sorry. I think that what I'm offering is a far more authentic and serious conversation. When it comes to reparations, it's simply time to get down, put some money on the table, start talking and start negotiating. There is a debt that needs to be paid. And I believe the question now is not evidence about the problem, but a serious conversation about the solution.
And in terms of the types of reparations, I know in California and San Francisco in particular, there are a plethora of ideas of what reparations should look like, such as not having taxes for Black business owners or purchasing homes for $1. Do you have a specific plan in terms of reparations?
Yes, I do. First of all, I think if I owe you money, it's not my business how you spend it. So my plan involves what I think of as a council of Black elders that would be people and intergenerational also, because I think the money should be dispersed over 20 years. I think we should be talking at least in the realm of $1 trillion as our starting bid, as it were. If you have people, Black leaders from from business, Black leaders from culture, Black leaders from politics, Black leaders from religion, and like I said, various ages. The money is to be for education and economic renewal. Within that, how the money is dispersed, whether it's a historic Black colleges, whether it's economic renewal, degentrification, whatever it is, to be honest, I believe that those decisions should be made by Black people and not white people.
And you mentioned Medicare for All. This week marks 13 years since the Affordable Care Act was passed into law, which led to a significant decline in uninsured Black Americans. But health disparities persist for many Black people in America. I know you support Medicare for All, and you are not the only Democrat to support the idea of Medicare for All. But how would you make it happen if you were president?
Well, first of all, the actual legislation does have to come from the legislative branch, obviously. My greatest contribution to that happening would be, number one, the conversation I have with the American people, which I believe is starting right now. I think a lot of people who are hearing me on this campaign point out that this is what we have. This is what the citizens of every other advanced democracy have. I don't know how many Americans realize that 18 million Americans cannot afford to fulfill their prescriptions given to them by the doctors. 68,000 Americans die every year from lack of health care. 85 million Americans are underinsured or uninsured. I'm sure most people listening right now know at least one person who is rationing their insulin. I think that what's happening in this country is that we are reaching the critical mass of enough is enough. Once there are enough people who realize it's time for this, we are not willing to just live our lives exploited like this. Our people are dying literally so that the insurance companies can make these tremendous profits. We have an $88 billion medical debt in this country. 1 in 4 Americans live with medical debt. Meanwhile, if you take the top 5 pharmaceutical companies and their profits of just in 1 year alone, that was $80 billion last year. People are getting to the point where I think they are willing to elect a leader who says, you know what, you have a right to be outraged about this, and we are going to do something about it. Then the people are still going to have to elect the Congress people and the senators who will bring it, but I'm going to be talking about it, not only with my power to sway whatever power I have to sway Congress, I'm going to be talking to the American people and inspiring them to speak to their Congress people, and I will, as opposed to the President Biden, who says that he would veto a Medicare for All bill, I will sign it with great joy.
You mentioned policing. Black communities, as you know, continuously witness countless deadly police encounters of primarily Black young men. One most recently in Virginia. There was also the beating death of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee. How would a Williamson administration address the issue of policing and race in America?
First thing I would do is I would call Cory Booker and Tim Scott. I would say, come over to the Oval Office, bring whoever you want, and we're going to have some serious bipartisan police reform bill here. This is going to happen, and I'm not going to stop until it does. It is absolutely unacceptable that Black mothers throughout this country are afraid to tell their sons, would you go to the store and get me a pint of milk? That is absolutely unacceptable. And I will not be talking about how we have to just do more to fund the police. We need to reform the police in this country. Everything from training to qualified immunity to chokeholds. There are many things. When the George Floyd bill did not pass, I would have liked to have heard the president express appropriate outrage. That's what you will have in me, is a president who names the problem, who isn't pussyfooting around the problem, who recognizes it as a national emergency and will seek to work with leaders both Black and white to come up with some actual solutions so that these horrors do not continue.
You previously mentioned how you would use the bully pulpit if you were president. President Biden has been touted for being a unifier, for being a president who kind of strikes a certain even tone that has been effective in Washington, especially when you think about some of the bipartisan legislation that was passed. He's seen as more of a moderate Democrat. You are a progressive. Do you think that you can be a unifier in Washington if you were president?
Well, first of all, those who are saying it's all such unity and happiness and peace apparently aren't looking at what's happening in this country. I mean, I don't think that this country is so unified, and I'm not blaming the president for that. But I am saying that this picture of him as a unifier, once again, I'm not blaming him for that, but his moderate appeal and his ability to work to some extent across the aisle in Washington, this is in contrast to the actual experience of what is going on in America. There is tremendous disunity in America. There is more than disunity. There is a neo-fascist authoritarian threat. FDR said we would not have to worry about an authoritarian fascist threat as long as democracy delivered on its promises. It's not about your tone. It's about, are you delivering on your promises? And democracy, the greatest hope that we can have right now for unifying this country is providing people with more of the means that they need in order to not be living in such survival all the time. Providing people with the blessings of democracy is the best bulwark against a fascist takeover. And that's why in the 2024 election, someone offering to the American people an agenda of genuine reform and real economic change in their lives is the only thing that's going to win. Telling them that the economy is good when for the vast majority of people it's not, is not going to win. And also, it's just so long you can say, vote for me, I'm not them. That's not going to work forever. So I believe the way to unify this country is to give to the majority of American people on both left and right the blessings of democracy that the citizens of every other advanced democracy already have.
It goes without saying that you can't quite talk about the 2024 presidential election and not say the name Donald Trump. Former President Donald Trump may soon be indicted by the Manhattan District Attorney and potentially other indictments to follow. What do you make of the former president and current presidential candidate, his current legal reality? And if he somehow ends up being still the nominee for the Republican Party, do you believe that you are the candidate to actually beat him, and why?
First of all, in terms of his legal troubles, the legal system should play out theoretically in the United States, although we know that this is not always true, talking about the issue of race. But theoretically, ideally, everyone is treated equally under the law. And so that's what should happen with Donald Trump. There are different ways that that could go, of course, because it could also, in the eyes of some, make him a martyr. That should just be what happens within the legal system. I will tell you this, Ron DeSantis does not scare me any less than Donald Trump in terms of the actual fascist ideas he has about Florida. When you're talking about telling people who even have undocumented workers in their car or in their house that they could be charged with a felony, when you're talking about taking books off library shelves, when you're talking about telling colleges what they can and cannot teach, the threat that I believe DeSantis poses in Florida, his fight against wokeness or whatever it is not something that we need in the United States. Both of them represent politics that are filled with lies. And the only way to defeat big lies is with big truths. And that's what I'm telling. The president does this thing that corporatist Democrats do. They tell the truth, but they don't tell the whole truth, and they don't tell nothing but the truth. We need to lay down some real truth telling in this country. Young people particularly are ready for it. I think disadvantaged communities are ready for it because they're tired of all the gaslighting. And I think the fact that I'm the one who would lay down the kind of fundamental, authentic, radical truth telling that I do is actually the only way to defeat the big lies that will be coming from Trump and perhaps others in 2024.
Any final thoughts to voters, particularly Black voters?
Well, I am a white woman. So as a white woman, there's a limit to what I can understand from the experience within a system. I can't understand what it feels like to be a Black person in America, but I am a student of history. I do come from a persecuted people myself, and I recognize the sweep of American history. I am somewhat of a student of American history. I understand the role of slavery from the beginning for almost 250 years. I understand the social justice movement of abolition. I understand the 100 years of institutionalized suppression in the form of segregation that followed the Civil War. I understand the importance of the Voting Rights Act in the mid-60s, which has been gutted by the John Roberts Supreme Court. I understand the significance of the Civil Rights Act, and I understand the one piece that has still not been taken care of, and that is financial remuneration. I understand the gap that exists between the wage earning of Black Americans and white Americans. I understand that as we close that gap, our economy will be $1.5 trillion larger. I understand there is a debt that is owed. I am a Jew, and after World War II, Germany paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. Obviously, this didn't mean that the Holocaust didn't happen, but it went far toward that financial remuneration, I believe, went far towards the psychological and emotional healing, as well as financial, between Germany and the Jews of Europe. We need to do that in our country as well. There is a debt that is owed. I would be a president who recognizes that and would do everything in my power to get it paid.
2024 presidential candidate, Marianne Williamson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.